Vasily Blokhin, The Geometry of Darkness and the Technology of Absolute Evil. The Atmosphere of Silence. Picture the streets of Moscow in the 1930s. While the halls of the Kremlin were ablaze with light and Soviet leaders debated grand industrial projects, and while the city air carried the scent of fresh asphalt and gasoline, something else was happening deep beneath the surface. In the damp, cold basements of the Lubyanka, the secret police headquarters, an intense and grim labor was underway. The kind of work that would never be mentioned in the pages of national newspapers like Pravda or Izvestia. In these hidden rooms, they were not drafting blueprints for factories or designing high-speed aircraft for the young Soviet Republic. Here, with a professional, methodical, and terrifyingly calm precision, they were eliminating those branded as enemies of the system. World history usually remembers only the names of those at the pinnacle of power, those who issued the fatal decrees. The names Stalin, Beria, and Yezhov have forever become dark symbols of that brutal era. But behind these leaders stood the men who transformed paper directives into bloody reality. These were the men whose palms physically squeezed the cold handles of pistols in basement execution rooms. Among them, one figure stands out, a man whose sheer productivity and long tenure in this profession cause even the most hardened historians to shudder. Vasily Mikhailovich Blokhin, Major General, recipient of 8 state orders, and a personal favorite of the Soviet High Command. He is officially recognized as the most prolific executioner in world history, with approximately 20,000 personal executions to his name. Try to comprehend the scale of that figure. This isn't just a dry statistic from a dusty archive. It represents 20,000 individual trigger pulls, 20,000 specific necks, 20,000 flashes of light in the darkness of a basement. Today, we attempt to reconstruct the true portrait of this man. We will go beyond a simple listing of biographical dates. We will step into his workshop, examine his specialized tools, and analyze his daily life. It is vital to understand how one man could kill for decades while remaining a devoted family man and a refined connoisseur of purebred horses. This is the story of how the banality of evil took on flesh and blood in the form of a humble man from a peasant family. Roots and the Bloody Fog, 1895-1921. Vasily Blokhin was born on January 7, 1895, in a remote village in the Vladimir province. His childhood was steeped in the leaden lifestyle, typical of the Russian countryside, a world of grinding poverty and hopelessness. Hard physical labor from dawn to dusk and the persistent smell of manure and damp earth accompanied him from his earliest years. By the age of 10, young Vasily was already working as a shepherd. This detail is key to understanding his later psychology. A shepherd in those times was someone who constantly observed the natural cycle of life and the inevitable, often brutal, death of animals. For a peasant's son, slaughtering livestock was not a personal tragedy. It was merely a daily industrial necessity. It was in the fields of the Vladimir region that his attitude toward death as a technological operation began to take shape. An animal had to be slaughtered quickly, cleanly, and efficiently to avoid ruining the final product. Years later, he would apply this pragmatic principle to human beings. A person had to be eliminated quickly and cleanly to avoid unnecessary trouble or staining one's uniform. In 1915, his life took a sharp and irreversible turn when he was drafted for World War I. Assigned to an infantry regiment, he first encountered death on an industrial scale. The millions of casualties and the total dehumanization of the front lines completely erased the value of the individual in his mind. He quickly proved himself to be an exemplary and obedient soldier, rising to the rank of non-commissioned officer. The secret to his success was simple. He never questioned orders. He simply carried them out. The revolution of 1917 found him in the army, and he unerringly chose the side of the new power. In 1921, Vasily Blokhin joined the Cheka, the first Soviet secret police. The young Soviet Republic desperately needed reliable executors for its dirty work, rather than revolutionary romantics. In his personal file from that period, his superiors noted his exceptional cold-bloodedness and ideological resolve. While other secret police officers were driven mad by the sight of blood or sought escape in alcohol, Blokhin quietly cleaned his weapon. He was a clean slate upon which the state could write any order. At 26, he had finally found his true calling, a professional instrument of state-sponsored violence. The logistics of death, the Lubyanka Conveyor. By the mid-1920s, Vasily Blokhin was firmly established at the Lubyanka, heading the commandant's office. Formally, he was considered a caretaker, responsible for garages, building security, and food supplies. But this administrative role was merely the official, public side of his life. In reality, Blokhin led a secret execution squad. It was he who transformed the chaotic executions of the Russian Civil War era into a finely tuned industrial process. Under his leadership, the basements of the Lubyanka became a literal conveyor belt that operated 24 hours a day. Blokhin personally designed and inspected specialized execution chambers. He insisted that the walls be lined with thick layers of felt or soundproofing rubber. This was not done out of any sense of humanity for the condemned, but solely for the psychological comfort of the staff. It was necessary to ensure that the sounds of the working machine of terror did not reach the streets of Moscow. Blokhin introduced an innovative double-door system for the time. The condemned would be led through one door for a final document check and then moved through another, where they were killed, and their bodies quickly removed. This logistic system allowed the bloody work to proceed without a single minute's interruption. He was the first to realize that to destroy thousands of people, death had to be made as anonymous and rapid as possible. A critical aspect of his industrial discipline was a strict dry law. Blokhin strictly forbade his staff from drinking vodka during executions. He believed a drunk executioner could make a technical error or, even worse, cause the victim unnecessary suffering. He demanded absolute sobriety and focus from his subordinates. The chief executioner himself preferred to drink strong tea with lemon, but only after his shift had ended. This icy discipline made him indispensable to the country's top leadership. While other executors quickly burned out or took their own lives, Blokhin only thrived. Instrumentation, the Walther instead of the Nagant. Every true master of his craft has a specific set of tools, and Blokhin was no exception. His professional choice was German pistols, rather than standard Soviet weapons. To understand his methodical approach, one must look at the technical details. The standard weapon for Soviet security forces at the time was the legendary Nagant revolver. However, Blokhin felt a deep professional disdain for it. There were several reasons. First, the Nagant had a very heavy trigger pull, which quickly exhausted the shooter's finger. When an executioner had to shoot 250 people in a single shift, his hand would begin to tremble involuntarily. Second, the revolver's drum would overheat after intense firing. Third, the 7.62 mm caliber was considered excessively powerful for this purpose. At point-blank range, the bullet would often pass through the victim, causing significant blood splatter and dangerous ricochets off the concrete walls. Blokhin found the perfect solution by personally ordering several suitcases of Walther PP pistols from Germany. These 7.65mm German weapons were more reliable and much quieter. The Walther's trigger was soft, and the bullet most often remained inside the victim's skull, which minimized the amount of blood in the chamber. For every mass operation, Blokhin brought a suitcase full of weapons. Inside were 5 or 6 fully loaded Walthers. As soon as one pistol became too hot from firing, the executioner would simply take a cold one from the suitcase. He didn't waste time reloading. That routine task was handled by his assistants. Blokhin functioned as a highly skilled pistol operator. We cannot forget his specialized work uniform, which became part of his sinister image. Before starting a shift, he would put on a long brown leather apron that reached his ankles. This was paired with a leather cap and high-cuff leather gloves. This was not a whim. It was strict hygiene. Leather was easily cleaned of biological traces and did not absorb the scent of death. After finishing his work, he would wipe his apron with a damp cloth, remove it, and step out into the fresh air completely clean. For Vasily Blokhin, there was no such thing as the smell of blood. There was only the service regulation. Executioner of the elite, from Tukhachevsky to Yagoda. One of the most chilling ironies of Blokhin's biography is that he became the cleaner for the system itself. Not only did he outlast all of his immediate superiors, but he executed many of them with his own hand. On June 12, 1937, Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky was led into the basement. A brilliant theorist and the pride of the Red Army, he stood before the executioner, beaten and in tattered clothes. Blokhin showed not a hint of respect for his past achievements or high rank. To him, Tukhachevsky was just another object on the daily liquidation list. A shot, a brief note in the documents. In 1938, it was the turn of Genrikh Yagoda, the architect of the Gulag system. Yagoda, who for years had signed execution lists, now stood before Blokhin, begging for mercy. But the chief commandant remained absolutely deaf to any pleas from his former patron. He pulled the trigger of his faithful Walther with the same calm he had shown thousands of times before. In 1940, Blokhin put a final end to the life of Nikolai Yezhov, the bloody dwarf who had unleashed the Great Terror. It is said that just before his death, Yezhov wept and sang the Internationale. But this elicited no emotion from the executioner. Some of the greatest figures of Russian culture also fell to his bullets. The writer Isaac Babel and the visionary director Vsevolod Meyerhold ended their lives in his workshop. Before the shot, Babel asked only for the chance to finish his last book. But Blokhin did not even deign to answer him. He was the perfect instrument of the state. No ears for pleas, no heart for compassion. He watched the rise and fall of the gods of the Soviet Olympus, while remaining the only constant in the basements of the Lubyanka. The Katyn record, 28 nights of industrial murder. The most horrific and large-scale achievement of Blokhin's career was an operation in the spring of 1940 by a secret decree of the Politburo. Thousands of Polish prisoners of war were to be liquidated immediately. Blokhin personally traveled to the city of Kalinin to organize and lead the process. It was here that his professional productivity reached its historic peak. Over 28 nights, he personally shot approximately 7,000 Polish officers. On average, this was 250 people per shift. One shot every 3 minutes, all night long, night after night. The process was organized like a flawlessly operating industrial conveyor belt. Powerful tractor engines ran constantly in the prison courtyard to mask the sound of the gunshots from the city's residents. Blokhin unfailingly appeared for his shift in his leather apron, suitcase of Walther's in hand. He worked in total silence, with absolute focus on the ballistic task at hand. After each bloody shift, he provided his assistants with plenty of vodka and food. He himself would go to breakfast and rest, maintaining complete sobriety. For the successful execution of this operation, Blokhin was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. It was the events at Katyn that placed his name in the Guinness World Records. To a modern American, the figure of 7,000 people killed by a single executioner in 1 month seems technically impossible. But Blokhin proved otherwise. If you turn murder into a bureaucratic act, the capabilities of a human being become limitless. The 2 lives of the general, horses and blood. To truly grasp the scale of Blokhin's personality, we must look beyond the execution basements. What did an average day look like for a man whose hands were covered in blood? Imagine this: the executor, who has just shot 250 people, calmly returns home to his family. He lived in a prestigious building for the NKVD's top command in central Moscow. He had a loving wife, Natalia, and a son, for whom he was a pillar of support and protection. Neighbors remembered Vasily Mikhailovich as an exceptionally quiet and polite man. He never raised his voice, was always the first to say hello, and appeared to be the embodiment of Soviet prosperity. His primary passion in life was horses. Blokhin could spend hours at the hippodrome stables, discussing the nuances of caring for purebred animals and understanding their temperaments. His personal home library contained rare and expensive volumes on architecture and horse breeding. This chilling duality of life is staggering. By day, he could be passionately studying designs for new buildings, discussing proportions and styles. By night, he would put on his leather apron and descend into a basement smelling of gunpowder and death. Psychologists might call this compartmentalization or split personality. But for Blokhin himself, it was a form of survival. He never viewed himself as a common murderer or criminal. In his own mind, he remained a state cleaner, performing the necessary hygiene of the system. Just as he had slaughtered livestock on the farm in his childhood, he now slaughtered the enemies of the great state. A total lack of reflection allowed him to maintain his sanity, where others lost theirs or ended their lives with a bullet to their own heads. Surviving in Stalin's shadow, the master's protege. Vasily Blokhin's relationship with Joseph Stalin was truly unique. The leader knew his chief executor personally and trusted him more than many of his famed marshals. The reason for this trust was simple. Blokhin never, as a matter of principle, got involved in high politics. He did not participate in backroom intrigues or create his own factions within the department. He remained an ideal instrument of power. Sharp, cold, and always ready for immediate use. There is a well-known historical episode from 1938 when Beria tried to have Blokhin arrested. Beria wanted to completely replace the old guard of executioners and bring in his own people to rebuild the system around himself. However, Stalin personally crossed Blokhin's name off every arrest and execution list. The leader uttered a phrase that was later whispered throughout the ranks. "We have very few executors like him. He must not be touched." For his absolute loyalty, Blokhin received everything a Soviet citizen could dream of. An enormous salary for the time, personal bonuses for special assignments, and the Order of Lenin, the highest award of the empire. While the rest of the country lived in constant fear of a midnight knock at the door, Blokhin felt completely secure. He was protected by the highest and most reliable wall of all, Stalin's personal will. But he did not realize a simple truth. When that wall finally collapsed, he would be the first to be buried under the rubble. 1953, the beginning of the end. On March 5th, 1953, Vasily Blokhin's world finally came crashing down. Stalin's death instantly transformed him from an untouchable specialist into a dangerous witness to the past. The system that had protected him for decades vanished overnight. The new leadership, led by Nikita Khrushchev, began a cautious dismantling of the Stalinist terror apparatus. Blokhin was sent into an honorable retirement almost immediately after the leader's funeral, in April 1953. The official reason was retirement due to health. He was 58 years old. At first, he retained his rank of Major General, his benefits, and a substantial state pension. But this was only the eye of the storm. Soon, an active campaign began to cleanse the ranks of the legacies of Beria and Stalin. In 1954, Blokhin was officially stripped of his rank of Major General. The decree stated that he had discredited himself during his service and was unworthy of the high rank of general. For a man who had served the system faithfully his entire life, this was a moral execution. The very system to which he had given thousands of lives publicly declared him unworthy. All his medals were taken away, his special food privileges were revoked, and his access to elite medical clinics was closed. Vasily Blokhin was left alone with his dark past in an empty Moscow apartment. Ghosts in the Dark and the Final Bullet. The final months of Vasily Blokhin's life on Earth became a chronicle of rapid personal disintegration. The man whose nerves had been considered iron for 30 years began to slowly break. According to witnesses, Blokhin began to drink heavily, attempting to drown either his conscience or a terminal sense of betrayal. Hard alcohol became his only way to fall into a fleeting sleep. It was said that the lights in his apartment burned 24 hours a day, as the old executioner had developed a pathological fear of the dark. In that darkness, he reportedly saw the ghosts of those 20,000 people whose necks he had once viewed through the sights of his Walther. He became a helpless hostage to his own professional memory. The man who had shown no mercy to thousands of others could now find not a shred of peace for himself. On February 3rd, 1955, Vasily Blokhin died. The official death certificate cited a myocardial infarction, but few believed it. Among former Lubyanka staff, the story always persisted that he had taken his own life. It is suspected that he shot himself with that same personal Walther he had kept as a souvenir. The final shot in his long and bloody career was turned upon himself. He was buried at the Donskoye Cemetery in Moscow. By a cruel irony of fate, this cemetery had for decades been the site of mass burials for the ashes of his victims. The executioner found his rest in the very same earth he had for years fertilized with the bodies of the shot. For a long time, his grave was completely forgotten. But in recent years, a new monument has been erected. It features a portrait of the general in full-dress uniform, adorned with all the medals of the empire. Epilogue: The Right to Memory and the Curse of the Record. Vasily Blokhin has forever remained in history as the most prolific executioner of death sentences in human history. His name in the Guinness World Records is a dubious honor, backed by mountains of human bodies. By his example, he proved a horrific truth. Any ordinary person can become a perfect instrument of murder. All that is required is to stop asking questions and simply start doing your job. Today, we look at the Katyn forest and the basements of the Lubyanka as grim monuments to an era that must never be forgotten. Blokhin was just a small cog in a vast system, but he was a cog without which the machine of terror would not have operated so efficiently. Thank you for watching this in-depth analysis to the very end. Your support and interest in these complex historical chapters mean the world to us here at Red Empire Wars. Every subscription and every comment helps us continue uncovering the truth behind the shadows of the past. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation into the hidden files of history. The story continues, and it demands the truth.